What's up, everybody? Y'all thought we was gone, but we back. It's Stir Crazy, episode 46, the First Amendment up in flames. I'm your host, Kim Brown. This is all being brought to you by the Real News Network. We've got a heavy show on deck for you today. Of course, everyone's talking about a lot of different things, but first and foremostly, the memory of George Floyd being observed today in Minneapolis with his memorial service just wrapping up just several moments ago. Really good service, very Black church experience, for mainstream America who may not always get a chance to see what that looks like and see how that is executed. But a really good service. I did watch part of that. But also that's coming on the heels of additional charges against the 4 officers who are seemingly responsible for the death of George Floyd, with charges being escalated against Derek Chauvin and the other 3 officers now being charged with serious felonies. We'll discuss that and the new policy changes that are perhaps coming behind that out of Minneapolis. Of course, we know that this is all a result of long organizing, demonstrations, and protests. I don't know how much voting had to do with this. It seems to me that thousands and thousands of people in the streets over a sustained period of time is the reason why we're seeing some policy changes coming out of not only Minneapolis, but Los Angeles as well has announced some different things that they will do in regards to funding policing in the coming months and years. So we'll talk about that as well. So as usual, we love to hear from y'all in the comments and in the chats. I'm being advised that y'all are already in there getting it live early. So we appreciate it. Thanks to all our regulars and everybody that's new. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe under this here program. But right now, it's time to bring in 2 of our panelists. We're having some other people join us a little bit later. But right now, let me introduce fan favorite. They love her in the comments. They always say her name with fist and fire emojis. A host and producer here at The Real News, also co-host of the radio show By Any Means Necessary, Jacqueline Luqman. And our visuals and research producer here at The Real News. But Andrew is smarter than the average bear. That's why we like to have him here on Stir Crazy with us. Andrew Corkery is on with us again. What's up, gang? How y'all doing?
All right. How are y'all?
Good.
Tired. It's been a mentally exhausting 7 days, and I'm sure for the people that have been out in the streets, they are equally as mentally and physically exhausted, if not more than that. But Gabriel, let's jump right into this first. Do we have footage of George Floyd's memorial? Because George Floyd is being remembered over a course of services. The first one today being held in Minneapolis, another one to be held in his hometown of Houston, Texas, and I thought I heard about a third in North Carolina. His family spoke. They spoke very eloquently about their humble beginnings. They reinforced that they didn't come with much or come from much or have much growing up, but how George Floyd's mother instilled a sense of community and all-inclusiveness, and how George, would have some of his friends when he was a, teenager and a young man come stay with them. Friends who may not have come from good family situations themselves, but they always knew they could get a meal at George's house because his mom was going to be there taking care of everything. Like I said, a display of Black Christianity and how Black folks do homegoings. A lot of singing, good preaching. Whatever your opinions are about Reverend Al Sharpton went up there and did what he do, and that is preach a good service, which I would definitely say that he did. And a lot of notable people were in the crowd today to remember George Floyd. They had a big overflow in the streets with monitors set up. I think I saw NBC News reporting there was roughly 1,000 people there out in the streets. People who were not able to get in. Of course, you saw lots of masks, as you just witnessed in the video, because they are still trying to practice social distancing. I mean, even that news about George Floyd, that he had COVID-19, but was asymptomatic, but just not a good situation all around. In addition to the knee on his neck. Jacqueline Luqman, I want to start with you because there was an announcement from the Minnesota Attorney General yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, that there's more charges have been filed against these officers. Derek Chauvin now charged with second-degree murder. The other officers, let me get their names right, who were also charged were Officer Total, J. Alexander Kuhn, and Thomas Lane, each of them charged with aiding and abetting a second-degree murder while committing a felony and with aiding and abetting second-degree manslaughter with culpable negligence. Both charges are categorized as unintentional felonies. That reporting from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. Jackie, is this enough, or what? We know that this is really just the first hurdle in what's going to be a very difficult process.
Remember that all of the officers in the death of Freddie Gray were charged, and they were all let free. So no, this is not enough. This is a start, and it's a start that only happened. Remember, let us never, ever forget this point. I don't care what anybody says about protests and rioting and looting. Fuck that. I don't really care about businesses' property damage when we're talking about institutional police terrorism against communities of color, Black, Latino, Native American, and poor white communities of color. Not as many as Black and Latino and Native American people, but it does happen. But this is a step that only happened because people, not just around the country, but around the world, took to the streets and literally said, enough of this shit. That's what happened. That is the only reason these charges were escalated from third-degree murder, whatever that was, up to second-degree murder. And it's the only reason these other three officers were arrested. Had people not taken to the streets and expressed their anger, we would still be looking at one of the perpetrators in prison and the other three probably in the wind somewhere, and the one with some crappy charges. Now, having said that, we have to remember the demographics of Minneapolis. It's not a majority Black city. It is majority white. So unless that trial is moved, if there is an indictment from the charges, unless that trial is moved to a place where the demographics will lend to a more equal jury pool, it is highly likely that that jury will be mostly or all white. And unless a miracle from the Lord happens, I'm not expecting a conviction on the charges that are being leveled. I'm not going to say that they won't convict on something. But listen, I think we've been down this road enough times for enough Black people to be real wary about celebrating where we are right now.
Andrew Corkery, as Jackie said, a very small percentage of police who are ever charged with the murder of someone in custody or under their charge, under their care. It's such a low percentage of convictions. People have a right to be pessimistic and skeptical, and people in Minneapolis in particular, because officers were acquitted of the murder of Philando Castile, and I believe it's Jamal Clark. Also, there was not a conviction in his police-assisted murder there either. But do you think that these charges were mostly made to placate the people in the streets, to get people out of the streets, perhaps?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of political calculus involved when it comes to drawing up these charges. I mean, Keith Ellison, the guy that's running this whole investigation, who's looking into this. I think he's under a lot of pressure right now, obviously, from what's going on in the streets all over the country. And I think the people just need to follow suit by keeping that pressure up to make sure that, people don't become well adjusted to injustice. And I think that what you're seeing is that this time around, it appears that there's more white allies who are involved in this process, and more, there's videos of white people kind of, standing in front of Black people, in front of the police, just, making sure that if the police are going to do anything, they're going to have to go through that group of people first before they get to the people of color. So I think that's something that hasn't really manifested in a real tangible way on a large scale to this moment and until this moment. So I think that that's an important development and could, potentially on how the jury and stuff like that works out, could lend a different outcome potentially. But I do share Jacqueline's skepticism that, regardless of who's on the jury and what happens, we're living in a country that has an institutionalized, racist government and racist, policies that exist. So the evidence and what have you is going to have to overcome that benchmark and not, the typical benchmarks that, white people have to overcome. There's a tacit complicity of the justice system in kind of enforcing this racist structure within our society and within the judicial system. So that's going to have to be overcome. And the only way that gets overcome is by people, being out in the streets and putting the pressure on and making sure, their voices are heard and, not giving into this racist, system, but also to the police brutality that we're seeing every single day.
Mm. Gang, I'd like to bring in our third panelist today. Danny Haiphong is a contributing editor at the Black Agenda Report. He's our third voice today. Danny, we appreciate you being here and for making some time to share your thoughts and perspective with us.
Yeah, sure. No problem. Thanks for having me.
Hey, so I'd actually like for us all to take a look at Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. He gave a pretty impassioned press conference to the people of Minnesota regarding addressing structural racism within the institutions of law enforcement and criminal justice. And he seemed to understand that people in the streets, organizers, the Black community, Native communities, or whatever, have heard all this before and not interested in his lip service, if that is indeed what it is. But I'd like for y'all to check out what he had to say.
So on behalf of the people of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and all of Minnesota, we owe Terrence Floyd and the Floyd family an immense debt of gratitude to help bring that message and bring that peace. We also owe them what I heard yesterday. I walked outside my house, and it's very clear that's not a place they needed to hear me. And as some said, you should listen, but don't expect to get any credit for listening if you don't do something about it, because we've heard it before. And when they mean we heard it before, they're not just even talking in Minnesota, which they certainly are talking about that. But I think all of us come to understand we're not going to restore peace on our streets by having a bigger group of National Guard show up. We're not going to establish peace on our streets by keeping a curfew in place all the time. We're going to establish peace on our streets when we address the systemic issues that caused it in the first place. And that is what every voice on the Capitol is saying. That's what the voices in front of my house are saying. That's what Terrence Floyd is saying. And that's what we need to start saying. So whether it was from the colonial period through Jim Crow, it's still with us. And here in Minnesota and across this country and now the world, if this is not an inflection point to change that or risk what we're seeing, this will come back again if it's not addressed. This will not go away once the fires are put out and there's a lull. And I think we've seen very clearly, if you can create the space to start doing that, you separate out those who have no time or tolerance for destruction from those who have no time or tolerance for systemic racism. Those are two very different things. And so I hear you. I've listened to community leaders. We together have seen this, city council members and others, and they're asking for structural change, specifically things that we can deal with. And today, I'm here to talk about the structural change that needs to start with the Minneapolis Police Department. We know that deeply seated issues exist, and the reason I know it is we saw the casual nature of the erasing of George Floyd's life and humanity. We also know by the reaction of the community, they expected nothing to happen. And the reason is because nothing did happen for so many times. I hear and listen and stood next to mothers who lost their children in this and say so many times, as I heard Mayor Carter say, I've heard others echo, Being black should not be a death sentence. And for each and every one of us in law enforcement, you don't get judged right on the spot, especially with the finality of being killed in police custody. So Minnesotans, you can expect our administration to use every tool at our disposal to try and deconstruct systemic racism that is generations deep. And as we move forward, we're going to need to do it with the community. But I think the thing I'm hearing from the protesters is we're not watching and we don't care what you say. We care what you do. So today, as a step towards that deconstruction of systemic racism, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights is filing a commissioner's charge of discrimination to launch a civil rights investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department. The investigation will review MPD's policies, procedures, and practices over the last 10 years to determine if the department has utilized systemic discriminatory practices towards people of color. Minnesota has one of the strongest civil rights laws in the country. It is illegal for police departments to discriminate against someone because of their race. This is the first time that the state is launching a civil rights investigation into the systemic discriminatory practices of the largest police department in the state. It is also the only investigation surrounding the killings of George Floyd, focusing on the policies and practices implemented by the Minneapolis Police Department. When the Minnesota Department of Human Rights finds civil rights violations, they seek structural change to prevent discrimination from occurring again. The Minnesota Department of Human Rights will also seek an agreement with the Minneapolis Police Department to implement interim measures immediately in advance of long-term measures to address systemic discriminatory practices. This effort is only one of many steps to come in our efforts to restore trust within those communities who have been unseen, unheard, and believe that those that are charged to serve and protect not only don't do that, they work against them. And I say this, as a white man who walks through that life with pretty much relative ease, I can't ever know the pain of that black community members. But I hear you, I'm listening, and one of the things I need to do is use that ability to change and use that ability to build coalitions to make this situation that has become intolerable across the nation, that will not go away with tough talk and more people on the streets in uniform. It will go away with a sense of community you see being displayed up on the state capitol lawn today, with law enforcement and the people that they serve seeing themselves as neighbor in the same society and the same opportunities for their children.
That was Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. Daniel, I wanted to get your reaction to that. I mean, he did say a lot, and I did give him a lot of country to sort of make his point, because number one, I'm not accustomed to hearing politicians. I guess, let me rephrase. I know that people adapt and sometimes adopt the messaging of the organizers, which we heard, a lot of those familiar terms come out of his mouth, which is something I'm not used to hearing coming out of the mouth of a white governor. But at the same time, for him to reveal that this is the first time ever that there has been a civil rights inquiry into the practices of the Minneapolis Police Department, to me sounded stunning, given their long history of brutalizing the community. What was your take about what the governor had to say there?
I think there are many components to what he was saying. It's obvious that with so many thousands in the streets around the outrage of George Floyd's murder and just the murder of Black people by the police at such a high rate every 36 hours about, that there is a need. And I think a lot of these officials from all levels of government are feeling the need to talk about this problem and actually respond, at least in the minimum way, because I really do see this as responding at the bare minimum to what the protesters and what the people are raising. It is interesting to see this language of oppression, this word structural change get thrown around, because what we're really seeing here is not really structural change. All of this is sort of already in existence, right? That the state itself has these tools to at least investigate itself in some way around issues of quote unquote civil rights. However, I don't really see any of this changing the relations of power and really giving people, especially Black people, any sort of real significant redress against the police and the mass incarceration state as a whole. That's what I was thinking as I was hearing him talk.
Jackie, I'd like to get your response to the governor.
Yeah, I mean, it's great that he gets the historical connections, or at least, he was able to read the notes that say he gets the historical connections, but I don't trust any police department to investigate itself and come away with any different examination or any different outcome other than, okay, we were kind of bad sometimes, but mostly it's not so bad, and we really don't need to do much to change things. I mean, and what is striking to me is that all of these mechanisms, like Danny said, were in place. You know, Minnesota has allegedly the most stringent civil rights law in the country. Well, how come Minnesota also has a police department that has an atrocious history of brutalizing not just African Americans in Minneapolis, but also the Native American community? Remember, not remember, a lot of people don't know that Minneapolis is the birthplace of the American Indian movement. There's a large indigenous community in Minneapolis, and there is a long history of police terrorism against Native people in Minneapolis. So where were all of these great tools, this great law, you know, all of this oversight and all these fabulous ideas before the very public lynching of George Floyd in 2020, and before an uprising that happened after 3 days when there was no response from any official in bringing those cops to justice? And then all of a sudden, after some property gets damaged and people think the city is going to be burned to the ground, then all these ideas come out and everybody understands the connection between colonialism and Jim Crow and blah, blah, blah. It's not community control over the police. They're not going to do that. It's not ending the 1033 program. They're probably not going to do that. So, I mean, again, my perspective is shaped from 52 years of skepticism because of 52 years of seeing a lot of lip service and a lot of impassioned speeches by well-meaning white people that end up amounting to much of nothing. So I think we're just going to have to stay in the streets. He's not going to like it, but I think that's what's going to happen.
Andrew Corkery from the comments, and Thea Napper says, this is a better speech than Biden gave. And, let's see, we have another comment here as well. Debbie
not
J.
hard to do.
Noted.
Oh, sorry.
Debbie J says, if this country wanted to change, policymakers would have made those changes during the civil rights era. All they saying now is blah, blah, blah. Did you hear a lot of blah, blah, blah from Governor Walz, or did you feel that perhaps he was sincere in his words, but again, his actions still remain to be seen how much emphasis and effort is actually put into what he so impassionately spoke about?
Yeah, I mean, he seemed legitimate, in his concerns and his, his issue with what was going on at this particular moment. But I think that, like you said, a lot of this remains to be seen, because when he's up there kind of talking about structural change and systemic change and all these different things and upending kind of the systematic racism of the government and of the police department, it doesn't appear that he realizes that that's not possible in the current, distillation of the system that we have. So I kind of agree with Danny in that sense that while he might be well-meaning, I think, I don't think he totally understands that you can't fix the level of problems that are in this system by utilizing the tools within the system itself. And that disconnect is really problematic and causes a lot of cognitive dissonance, rightfully so, for people of color and people who are dramatically impacted this over a period of generations.
Gang, I wanted to pop up that tweet, Dwayne, from the vote regarding the Minneapolis school district, because, as I said, there's been a long history of organizing of police abolition in Minneapolis. And this was being reported yesterday, or actually June 2nd, that the Minneapolis public schools, they have voted unanimously to end its contract with the Minneapolis Police Department. This is involving having school resource officers from the MPD in public schools in connection to the death of George Floyd. And this week I had an opportunity to speak with Tony Williams. He's an activist and an organizer who works with groups in Minneapolis like Reclaim the Block and MPD 150. And we spoke about police abolition, something that is being at least bandied about more so now probably than ever. And he explained that the abolitionist movement recently in Minneapolis came out of the disappointing non-convictions of the police officers who killed Jamar Clark and Philando Castile. This is what Tony Williams had to say.
It became clear to a lot of us that the surface level reforms that were being advocated for by a large part of the protest movement weren't actually moving the needle, and even when they were passed, weren't changing the underlying conditions that lead to Black folks being killed by police. And so we decided it was time for us to draw on the wealth of abolitionist knowledge out there and start thinking about what a police-free Minneapolis looks like. So what that means to us is that we're looking for a Minneapolis that is not reliant on armed safety patrols of people from outside our community, usually white folks, and usually folks deeply implicated in white supremacy. And we want to be able to keep our own community safe. We want to be able to have enough resources to support people on the ground here in Minneapolis and make sure that they get their needs met. If we do need crisis response, mental health crisis response, domestic violence crisis response, we want it to be trained folks from our communities who are not armed unless they absolutely have to be, and who are really deeply dedicated towards the safety of all involved, rather than the criminalization of all involved.
Danny, the discussion around police abolition is probably gaining more steam now than it has ever outside of organizational, spaces and radical left spaces. What have you noticed about the advancing of this movement and whether it's gaining traction from your perspective?
It's definitely gaining traction in terms of just how many people, especially who are participating in these protests, are feeling and are vocalizing their deep distrust of the police and are willing to get behind ideas like defunding the police, which could be seen as a way towards the abolition of the police. What's interesting about this question to me is that it really gets to the heart of what this society is really all about and organized around, which is why I think this demand and fleshing it out and discussing and debating it is really important. Because when you start talking about a community, especially a community that's occupied by the police, like so many, if not all, Black American communities are, you start talking about what function do police really serve, and then what can we do to actually replace our own kind of organization, and then hopefully our own kind of society that is not predicated upon the need for police departments, armed bodies, special bodies of armed men to protect what really is just private property and the property of the rich. I mean, that's what we're really talking about when we talk about police departments. That's why this virulent white supremacy exists in police departments. That's why they're militarized the way that they are. And I think what I've noticed is that this conversation is definitely more amenable to so many more people now that so many folks have seen what happened to George Floyd. So many folks are seeing what happens to especially Black people all around the country, facing premature death and murder at the hands of the police.
Jackie and Andrew, when you have conversations with, maybe not y'all's friends and family, but, I feel like mainstream America, Black, white, and brown America, there's a lot of elements there who cannot even conceive of a society absent of policing. It is so ingrained and indoctrinated in us, from children, where we're taught about officer friendly, right? You know what I mean? And so when you talk to people who may not be familiar with this concept or who just, I guess, kind of lack the imagination of how this sort of thing could be implemented society-wide. What has been your response from those that you interact with, deal with in your community when the issue of police abolition is raised?
It's a hard conversation to have, definitely, because the police as we know it in this country is all we know. And it's something that I have to admit, it was hard for me to get my mind around for the same reason. Like, what do we do without police? Well, when we start having the conversations about the things that police are responding to now, people are having mental health issues, and they're, unable to manage their behavior in public. Who do people call? The police. There is an eviction. Who do people call? The police. There's a fight in a school. Who do people call? The police. Are any of those situations appropriate for law enforcement, armed law enforcement to respond to? And that's where I kind of try to start the conversation. Like, okay, there might be, and I think as a society, we're over 300 million people in this country. And I don't know that we can ever not have some type of law enforcement. But what we don't need any longer is a law enforcement that is a catch-all for every civil disturbance that people feel like they don't have any other tools to deal with. That needs to, I think most people can get around that when you're talking about, should the police be responding to kids fighting in school? Heck no. Should the police be responding to people who have mental health issues who need some type of assistance? No, they should not. So I think from that perspective, it's easier to get people to understand the inappropriate ways the police are leveraged in this society to begin the conversation. And then we get into the stickier stuff of, okay, why do we need to have some areas of the city that are heavily occupied like a war zone? Then people are saying, well, it is a war zone because of crime. Well, then you can get into why do people commit crime? And then you just, I think, you build the conversation from there. At least that's my experience. But it's police abolition is a conversation that's not easy. It takes time. And you have to understand just, what is the role of the police? Really? They are here to protect capital. They're not here to protect us people. And what do we want to protect us to replace the police?
Yeah, and I'll just add on that too. Like, I think that it's an issue that's really difficult for white people to understand in a sense, I think, because of the fact that they view themselves historically as being protected by the police. So it's like it's their own private protection force for anything that, white people kind of deem to be a threat, even if it isn't. And obviously there's innumerable amounts of cases where, there isn't a threat presented, but, people present it as one to law enforcement. And then because of the racist and historical legacy of the police and the institutional racism and the violence of the police, they then interpret that same white racial bias onto the situation and or problem that they're dealing with at that time. So, but I'll just say that, there are actual, ways that police have already been, abolished. I mean, if you look at Christiania in Denmark, for example, I mean, that's an autonomous community of anarchists and, left-leaning people who are not policed and who are an autonomous region inside of Copenhagen within Denmark. So, I mean, while that might not be the most perfect example for this particular problem, there is precedence for this kind of thing evolving within society, and there's ways that we can expand out the ideas that we have to make a more informed critical analysis of how we implement a system like that. And in relation to white people, I mean, we already have the abolition of police in mainly upper class white communities. So, I mean, you don't have all these cops roaming around white communities that are privileged and or, middle class. That for sure as hell is not happening. So, I mean, it becomes a racial problem and it becomes a class problem too. And so addressing the root cause of that and trying to deal with that with a militarized police force is wholly inadequate because it's just institutionally organized in such a way where it's not even set up to deal with those problems, as you guys were outlining.
I just want to add real quick, Andrew, what you just said about the abolition of police in upscale neighborhoods, that just like popped into my mind, the idea of police serving to protect property. Like, people in wealthy neighborhoods, they have nice homes where they can commit all their crime inside, right? So, I mean, and
that white collar crime. It's all about that white collar crime.
It's all about that white collar crime. But if we're just talking about something simple like drug use, right? We know that white people do drugs just as much as black folks do, probably more. But white people are not doing their drugs like outside on the corner of their apartment building, because many of them have nice homes. Not all, because I know there's some white folks going to be like, well, not all white people have. Yes, you're right. But we're talking about upper class, wealthy white folks, a lot of white people live in a very different environment from a lot of poor black people who live in cities, in apartments, densely populated areas. So the stuff we both do are done, that's supposed to be illegal, are done in vastly different environments. White folks and their kids do their drugs in their nice homes, in their nice gated communities, where they have private security to keep outsiders out. But we in the hood, we do all our stuff in public pretty much because we don't have a lot of space. So we've got cops on all of our streets patrolling to keep us in. And everything we do is seen and scrutinized. So all of the regular stuff that everybody else does, we do it. So it seems like we do it more. It's publicized more. And then even the regular stuff that isn't quote unquote illegal, we're criminalized for that because of the environment that we are basically forced to live in. I mean, that just set off a whole nother like train of thought, what Andrew just said about upper class white people living in their homes in their gated communities, and the way the police are used to protect property. I don't know, that was just like really incredibly profound for me.
Oh, thanks. Well, I just want to say just real quick on that, like the media thing also too, is that look at the way that the media describes these incidents in black communities and in lower income communities that are also white as well. They describe them as, police involved shooting or police find drugs, you know what I mean? Like in black community. Do you hear anyone in real life like talk about that? Like if I said that somebody got shot, would it be like, oh yeah, police involved shooting? No, it would be police shot a person. You know what I mean? Like they literally killed someone or they shot someone. Like you wouldn't have that same deference for people who commit that act on their own without the institutional, infrastructure of a police department. And that has to be totally deconstructed. But anyway.
Jackie, folks in the comments would like to know what your shirt says.
Oh, hold on. There you go.
Make America pay reparations.
Mm-hmm.
I need one in a medium. Where'd you get that from?
Where did we get these from? Last year's African Liberation Day and the Uhuru movement. I think if you go to the Uhuru movement's website, I think it's uhurumovement.org. I think I think you can get this through them and a whole bunch of other t-shirts. We got one with Ella Baker on it. Yeah, I think if I'm remembering correctly, yeah, that's where we got it. The Uhuru movement.
I think I get their emails, but well, gang, speaking of police and police abolition and what the steps are to possibly head in that direction, one way has been to defund the police. In a lot of major American cities, you take a look at that city budget, bro, and you would probably be dismayed if you didn't already know that the likely chance that your city's police department is getting a lion's share of the city's budget, and that includes more so than public health, more funding than education, more funding than parks and recs, probably combined. I mean, it's probably really shitty. Well, Los Angeles Police Department, I'm sure you all have been seeing the videos on social media. I mean, LAPD has been out here showing their entire ass. And as we know from a lot of these things, it starts from the top down. Their police chief, it's either Michael Moore or Michelle Moore. I've seen it spelled Michelle, but I think I've heard it pronounced Michael Moore. This is a comment that he made a few days ago where he tried to blame those in the streets for the death of George Floyd. Let's look at that.
As for the safety of Los Angeles, last night we saw the full impact of the curfew with our ability to police areas of downtown and particularly and also the west side, but also the valley where we saw roving groups of individuals that were not compliant with the curfew and we believe were out to loot and prey upon businesses in our community. And our officers' actions were able to to identify those individuals and make a number of arrests. Last night, just under 700 arrests. And within those 700 arrests were 70 individuals who were either burglarizing or looting, victimizing businesses further. So what that tells me is that two things. We didn't have protests last night. We had criminal acts. We didn't have people mourning the death of this man, George Floyd. We had people capitalizing. His death is on their hands as much as it is those officers. And that is a strong statement. But I must say that this civil unrest that we're in the midst of, we must turn a corner from people who are involved in violence, people who are involved in preying upon others.
That video was courtesy of the Los Angeles Times. And as you saw, Police Chief Moore there said that statement with his entire chest. And he also thinks that we can't do math. He said less than 700 people were arrested on that given night. And he found that 70 of that fewer than 700 number of protesters were involved in some sort of alleged criminal activity, be it burglary or vandalism. Well, that motherfucker, that's under 10%, dog. I can figure that out. That doesn't sound like a large percentage of the people that you arrested were out here acting like hooligans. However, so you saw how much confidence and authority he just said what he said, that some of these protesters were responsible for the death of George Floyd as the actual cops who murdered George Floyd. Well, he said this weak-ass apology, not with his chest at all. Let's look at that.
There's another matter I must address, and that is yesterday, during the course of a press conference, I made a terrible mistake and misspoke regarding the death of Mr. George Floyd. Looting is in no way comparable to his murder. My remarks were meant to convey my frustration with those who, as they committed violence, attempted to justify their actions. I misspoke, and I did so terribly. I apologize, and I am sorry.
Oh, fuck him.
Exactly, Jackie. Now, we all know that the reason why he even got up there and made that apology is because the mayor of Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti, basically had to yoke his chain like, nope. That is not the tone that we are going to take for Los Angeles. But, y'all, the people of Los Angeles got in his ass. Not just his ass, but the whole ass of the rest of the LA Police Commission. What we just saw was a clip of a Zoom meeting that citywide, countywide, people were able to log on to and let the commission have an earful. It
was a beautiful thing.
It was
this like C-SPAN caller is like going awry right here. This is amazing.
It was incredible. Let's take a listen. This is just one comment, but there were many.
First things first, Chief Moore, you gotta do a better job of pretending you care about this, man. I've been watching you roll your eyes and offer half-hearted smirks, acting like a teenager who's falling asleep in detention. Are you not aware of the war crimes your department's doing, or are you just that impatient to go do more of them? I see a lot of you, particularly sober-off, only react when folks use profanity in their remarks. If you think curse words are bad, wait until you hear about these 600-plus murders your department has committed over the last 7 years. As long as Moore's out here equating peaceful protesters with cops who murder black people, you all could pretend to be as angry about murder as the F word, okay, kids? I know you're all having a rough day, what with everyone here telling you you're bad at your jobs. Have you considered being good at your jobs? If not, you could find new jobs in retail or restaurants. I know how desperate Garcetti is to get Angelinos consuming again during the global pandemic. Where were the curfews then? By the way, weird. Chief Moore is morally obligated to resign. Mikey, I know you said you didn't mean protesters are as much to blame for George Floyd's murder as his murderers. That's a lie. It is what you meant, and we all know it. Mikey's made it clear in his racist actions and empty platitudes that he doesn't care about the well-being of his constituents. He loves to tear gas them, blind them, force them indoors with curfews that are announced only a half hour before they take effect, and racially profile as he does so. Don't think I didn't hear about how yesterday you sent out an alert in English saying curfew started at 5 p.m. and sent out an alert right after in Spanish saying it started at 6. What's up with that, bud? All your cute Zoom background photos of the city won't trick us into thinking you care about anyone but yourselves and what's in your pockets. To close with a James Cameron quote, cops think of all non-cops as less than they are, stupid, weak, and evil. They dehumanize the people they're sworn to protect and desensitize themselves in order to do that job. That's you pigs to a T. Black Lives Matter, act like it. Happy Tuesday.
Happy
That video was posted by Twitter user Key Williams. If you go to their page, they have a thread of a collection of these comments and responses from Los Angelinos to their LA Police Commission. Danny, we've seen a lot happen across the country. LA is no exception. The mayor there, Garcetti, made the announcement today that they intend to cut somewhere in the neighborhood between $100 and $250 million out of the LAPD budget, and that they don't intend to add additional funds to this budget, at least not for the foreseeable future. What's your observations about from what we've seen develop over the past few days there?
I think you see a real sharpening of struggle. The fact that the police have had to make that concession, even though that's probably a very puny amount to them, given just how much support they receive from the federal government as well, militarily. It is a significant thing. What's just so interesting about all of what we just watched is, here in New York, there is sort of a sharpening struggle internally between the governor and the mayor, with the mayor, really coming down on the side of the NYPD, and Governor Cuomo, who can kind of, even though he is a corporate thug himself, a very pro-cop governor himself, he, tried to get out to the left on the left flank of Mayor de Blasio. And so we see all of these sort of sharpening contradictions around this question, because people, masses of people, especially with Black people in the lead, are forcing the issue. They're forcing these police departments, these local governments to respond in a way that they're just not used to. They're used to decades of gentrifying neighborhoods, leveling harsh austerity cuts, and then placing all of the funds, all of the money into the police in order to protect those folks like Amy Cooper, who calls the police to try to lynch a Black American male, to ultimately to protect those folks. I mean, that's kind of what Andrew was saying, with police already being abolished for upper class white Americans. Gentrification is a huge part of that process, bringing that into the cities, right? Militarizing poor Black communities, while at the same time using the police to protect those white American, especially those rich white Americans, from those folks that they're displacing. So, I think it's pretty incredible what we're seeing, but at the same time, we're in a real intense moment, and what comes out of this will be most important. How are people going to organize? How are people going to make those sentiments into something that leads to power at the bottom of society? Because these minor cuts are things that they may feel, the police departments, the local governments may feel they can do right now. However, I don't think it will change policing practices. I don't think it will change the character of the police departments, and it won't change just these larger trends that we're seeing that necessitate, at least in the eyes of the ruling class, necessitates more police, more militarization of the police, and more police influence over all sorts of aspects of ordinary people's lives.
Yeah, and I
go ahead, Andrew.
go ahead, Kim. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so basically, I was just going to say that, you know, I love how the LA police commissioner can go on television and say, you know, look at all of these people rioting and looting and burning stuff. They are incredibly violent and incredibly primitive, or whatever he's saying. When you run an organization responsible for more violence in Los Angeles than any other organization I can think of off the top of my head. Like, I mean, it's just the level of like Orwellian doublespeak is just like stupefying. And I just can't get over that. Like, I mean, he's comparing looting and, you know, rioting and burning buildings or whatever to just full onslaught murder of Black people in communities across Los Angeles. The two are just morally not equatable whatsoever. And he needs to go back to history class.
Yeah, I mean, I just, the whole, it's, where do I start? I love what Danny said about the fact that we are in a beautiful moment. And for those of us who have always, well, not always, but those of us who have invested a lot of time and a lot of our recent years to the struggle against this capitalist, imperialist, white supremacist system, not just police terrorism, but the entire system, this is a beautiful moment and struggle for us, because we are seeing people make these connections between the contradictions of that are inherent in capitalism. Everybody is seeing how the capitalist system does not work for people who don't have capital, which is most of us, the 99%. They're seeing how the system of law enforcement is inherently racist and does not respect people, but exists to protect capital, and how all of those systems serve the imperialist and colonial nature of the settler colonial project that is the United States of America. And it is beautiful to hear the calls that guy made. You know, I mean, even in COVID-19, which is such a period that is fraught with so much anxiety, the fact that people have this kind of access through a Zoom call to a meeting of the council of a city that otherwise would have been scheduled during the middle of the day or at a time when a lot of working people wouldn't have been able to get off and attend that meeting. It's beautiful to see that people are able to express an understanding that no, it's not just this person that's a problem. The whole damn system is rotten. And it is in these moments, I think, that we do have to be clear in picking apart the language that people like this police commissioner use. Like they're always talking about violence when they're really talking about vandalism. Violence is what is done when the police assault a person, take a person's life. Vandalism is breaking out a business's window. That's vandalism. This dude said that 70 people victimized businesses. How do you victimize a business? I mean, am I victimizing a business when I buy something, keep the tag on, wear it, take it back, and get a return? Is that victimizing a business? Is the business victimized? But no, they have insurance. They're fine. It's vandalism. And this whole 700 arrests thing, the hyper militarized police presence across the country in response to these protests ought to make clear to everyone that the cops will arrest you for anything they damn well say they want to arrest you for. You don't actually have to be violating any laws. All you have to do is be moving too slow, giving them some lip, looking at them in a wrong way. And if they're pissed off, then they just decide to arrest you and they'll call it something else. So all these numbers and terms and phrases these people use to justify their brutalization of an already oppressed population, but then to justify the further brutalization of people who are angry because they realize the shit they've been doing, it's not working. And it is beautiful to see.
Mm. And I think a lot more people are understanding that more so than a lot of other elements across the United States. I mean, we live in a police state. Like, make no mistake about it. We do not live in a representative democracy, because that shit can get shut down at any point in time. And the residents of Washington, D.C., Jackie Luqman, I know you can speak to this very personally, know that all too well. We all know that D.C. has been advocating for autonomy, for its own statehood, and this was a major issue that happened over the past couple of days, where the president or someone within the Trump administration made the calls for National Guards people to come in from outside of the district, mind you. There are Maryland National Guards in Washington, D.C. right now, and the mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, said, I didn't ask the motherfuckers to come in here. I called up the D.C. National Guard to patrol the streets. But then it's highlighted this demarcation between federal property and city property, and there are armed military right now in the streets of DC still, even though Mayor Bowser did announce that there will not be a curfew in place on the streets tonight of DC. There was the largest, I think, amount of demonstrations happened last night in DC, all peaceful, zero arrests. You know, we kind of understand what's going on here, but the Trump administration, Donald Trump is fortifying himself in the White House, building these higher fences. If you saw Build That Wall trending today, that is the reason why. Jackie, I wanted to ask you, what's it like to be a city resident and to see this, to see the military in your streets, many of them unidentifiable, not wearing any sort of identifying badges or anything with their name or badge number or from what agency they represent. I wanted to ask you that. And then I wanted to go to Andrew to ask about the story that came out. It was reported by BuzzFeed that the Drug Enforcement Administration has been given permission to investigate people who have been in the streets protesting. But Jackie, I want to start with you.
Well, I mean, the whole issue of DC autonomy, I mean, I hate to be a DC resident who says this, but I don't trust the city council of this city to be any more responsible with the autonomy of this city if we ever become a state than anybody else. I mean, that shouldn't preclude us from gaining statehood, because we do pay federal taxes. But Muriel Bowser, excuse me, is overseeing a police budget just for the police of $517 million, $500 million. Now, she said that she didn't want, like you said, Lisa, the Maryland National Guard in DC, but she was going to call up the DC National Guard. So what difference does it make? They were still going to be sitting around with it's still a National Guard. They were still going to be armed. So Muriel Bowser, who agreed to moving the curfew up 2 nights ago to 7 p.m. from 11 p.m. and announced it like an hour, she's complicit in all of this. She's a neoliberal, democratic shill who is a friend of every developer. That she's never met a developer who wanted to gentrify a poor Black neighborhood that she didn't like. She is an enemy of the people. She is no better and no different from Trump and his acolytes, excuse me, as far as law and order and policing is concerned. She's on their side. Don't be fooled by whatever little snarky tweet she puts out or the air she puts on her little press conferences. She is a law and order Democrat, and she's no different from the Republicans in this regard.
Andrew, talk to us about the DEA been giving the green light to spy on protesters, though I would think the FBI and the CIA would have that pretty much covered.
Yeah, you would think, considering the vast level of surveillance power that the federal government has, but basically the Drug Enforcement Administration has been granted this sweeping new authority to conduct surveillance and collect intelligence on people participating in these protests over the police killing of George Floyd, according to this 2-page memorandum that was obtained by BuzzFeed News. And then the DEA is limited by, or is typically limited by statute to enforcing drug-related federal crimes. But on Sunday, Timothy Shea, a former U.S. attorney and close confidant of Attorney Barr, who's running Trump's Justice Department right now, basically he was named acting administrator of the DEA last month and received approval from the Associate Deputy Attorney General Bradley Winchmine, and basically to go beyond the agency's mandate to, quote, perform other law enforcement duties that Barr may deem appropriate. So that sounds vague as hell, and sounds like it gives them a lot of power to do whatever the hell they want. So yeah, it's super problematic. But I think that this moment is also showing that, you know, Trump is so visceral in his, you know, dismay with these protests and just the general condition of our society at this point in time because of his own political reasons. But it's showing that, you know, there isn't a lot of there's not really a lot of daylight between some of the policies that these neoliberal Democrats want to do when it comes to, you know, enforcing, you know, more funding of the police or, you know, creating and upholding the system of neoliberal economics. So it's not showing the daylight, but at the same time it is, because all these mayors like Bowser and you know, Pelosi and all these people, they're sending out these little snarky tweets that are like faux resistance. Like they're like basically trying to say that they're against Trump, but like they're still approving all these stupid damn budgets that have militarized police and, you know, surveil communities of color. And so the policy difference is not that tangibly different. But the thing about it is the rhetoric and the way that they're presenting themselves is saying to the people, oh no, we are way different. But in reality, you're tacitly complicit in this whole system. So that needs to be clearly addressed. And this surveillance and all that stuff is all part of that, because we just saw all these Democrats sign on to Trump getting more warrantless surveillance power just a month ago. So, I mean, I don't understand, you know, why people aren't making this connection about, you know, the neoliberal Democrats and the connection with how the Trump administration is enacting these policies and is able to do these things.
Hey, Danny, I'm gonna let you get the last word here, because, you know, when I hear that it's been uncovered by journalists that yet another federal agency is going to devote significant resources to spying on protesters, I can't help but to think of all the protesters in Ferguson who were found dead under mysterious circumstances. Now, I'm not making the leap to saying that the government had some sort of connection, but I can't discount it either, given this government's long track record with targeting, sometimes fatally, activists who mobilize and try to organize on behalf of, you know, anti-racism and in favor of Black lives. When you hear this information, I mean, we saw the small concession given by Mayor Garcetti in Los Angeles about, you know, trimming $100 million from the police budget and reallocating those funds elsewhere. But, you know, with concessions comes consequence and pushback. What do you perhaps foresee the pushback against this progress that is made? Because oftentimes in America, as it relates to civil rights, it's, you know, one step forward and three steps back.
I think that the state, the U.S. state, in its totality, will for sure respond to these reforms in a very strong way. When you think about just the way that police unions have so much power over local governments and all the way up to the top with the federal government, I mean, one of the reasons I believe that Donald Trump has been so visceral in his response to this is because he is looking for that police union support all across the board, from the locals all the way up to the so-called internationals. That we're going to see that the whole program around Black identity extremists that the FBI enacted during the Ferguson Rebellion will continue to have consequences. And I believe the state will continue to use both covert and overt means to try to repress this movement as these reforms, right? I think it's a double-edged sword. As these reforms begin to be presented by the ruling class, they also begin to consolidate their state power in order to make the repression of the movement more acceptable because, hey, look, now cops have been charged. Hey, look, some of these police departments are now cutting funding. Hey, look, now there is more of a broad consensus among the so-called neoliberal Democrats that something has to be done and that they're supposedly on the sides of the protesters. Well, when I hear someone like Governor Cuomo say things like, well, looters are burning their own house, I start to think about how if it wasn't for these so-called violent rebellions, these rebellions that did target property, and if we don't start having this conversation about, well, even in the poorest Black community, the poorest working class community, none of the businesses offer really much of anything. That's one of the historic reasons why rebellions from all the way back to the 60s and before have been within mainly segregated and occupied communities, is because still those businesses just offer shit jobs, often collaborate, often are, tend to be from outside of the community themselves. We begin to see just how interrelated all of these issues are. And I think that we're going to see the state respond to these protesters in the same way as they have been, and perhaps be even more effective as reforms begin to be pushed through, regardless of how minor they are and how much they probably won't change the broader situation on the ground.
All right, gang, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank our panel for joining us today. Danny Haiphong, Jacqueline Luqman, Andrew Corkery. We appreciate you all stopping by. Thanks for stopping by and sharing your thoughts and your opinions and perspectives with us and our audience. Audience, of course, all the folks in the chat and in the comments. We always appreciate everything that you bring to the table as well. So we will see y'all on tomorrow. That would be Friday, kids, for another episode of Stir Crazy. I'm your host, Kim Brown. If you have any questions, comments, or critiques, we like to hear from my haters too. We don't care. Stir Crazy at therealnews.com. Check y'all tomorrow. See ya.